Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I will not waste time to talk about my person or so. We just go into the matter of science journalism. And when I give a talk or when I give a lecture to my students in Berlin, I usually start with showing this slide, if I can show it. I can't show it. Okay, I'll try. Oh yeah, here it is. This is one of the typical products of physics, and I mean everybody here in the room knows what it's about, I'm sure. I mean, I studied a little physics. Even to me, it is a complete mystery. And when I start my lecture in Berlin, I ask my students, okay, go to one of the libraries of hard sciences, pick out by random some of the journal articles and bring them to the next session. And they do that. And in most cases, they are even unable to read the title of these journal articles. And I mean, this is to make clear that science is a very, very esoteric endeavor in our society, and that it is very difficult to find access, as a lay people, to find access to it, and not only to understand it, but to understand that it makes sense at all. So, if I manage to get the next slide. Okay. The problem of perhaps the major problem of science journalism is making clear the relevance to the media audience. And relevance, in my understanding, means connecting it to discourses members of the audience are likely to engage in. That means to something they would talk with their neighbors or their family members or some expert or some politician about. And if you, as a journalist, can manage to do that, you present something relevant to the members of the audience, to your audience. If you can't, then it will most likely be neglected by them. So the first aspect of this ability to connect to ongoing discourses the audience is involved in is to solve the problem of comprehensibility. If you remember the first slide and the title of the paper, this is a very hard thing in many instances. Not always, but in most cases, perhaps science is more or less completely incomprehensible to lay people. There are also very complicated things in politics or in economy, but still the problem of comprehensibility is not that strong, because with respect to politics, members of the audience are involved as citizens, they vote. With respect to economy, they are involved as consumers, for example, or people who have a bank account, who have to lend money or bring their savings to the bank. This is not true for science. So in science, lay people do not have a proper role. But comprehensibility is only one issue. The perhaps more difficult issue, at least in some cases, let's say about comprehensibility. This has given rise to many cartoons showing this incomprehensibility of modern science. And here it's obviously scientists talking to a journalist and the journalist demanding a more comprehensible account of the finding. And the scientist says, well, actually, this is already the simplified version for the general public. Many jokes are made about this esoteric character of science. But it's not only the comprehensibility, it is also, well, makes it, even if I could understand, would I want to read about it? And the second problem you have to solve as a science journalist is showing that the topic you are talking about concerns or affects the audience in some way. There are many different ways in which the finding or in which science can make sense to lay people. Some of them are relating it to experiences of lay people, to everyday knowledge, school knowledge about science, values, religious beliefs. And you can present scientific results as either confirming those pre-knowledge, these pre-beliefs, or as contradicting those beliefs. Then it can relate to individual or social problems, public health, health issues, environmental issues, and so on and so forth. And you can use something like general meaning patterns. That means you can talk about the personality of a scientist. There are many nice films about science who portray scientists and their passion and their love for science and the struggle with the problem and so on and so forth. Or you can report on science even if the science itself is incomprehensible as a kind of competition between nations. So is Japan in advance to United States, it's Germany lagging behind Canada and so on and so forth. All those kinds of stories you can make without going into the content of science. And this seems to be one of the main strategies of science journalism, using those general meaning patterns. A competition makes sense. We are used it from sports, even if the actual content of the contest and the competition is rather unimportant. And the topics you have to address, or you can address as a science journalist, is not only the contents of science, it means the research results, it can also be the people, the processes within in science, fraud, and the social organization. Is it really useful to have that kind of peer review for proposals, and so on and so forth. So, looking at the required skills of science journalists, you first have the ability to explain things, to explain difficult things. And there are some methods that are usually applied, that is using examples, that is using comparisons or metaphors, even arguing black box, blending something out of the explanation chain and treating it as a black box, and so on and so forth. But the other crucial skill journalists in general, but of course also science journalists have to have, is that they are able to anticipate the manifest or latent information demand of the audience. That means journalists should be able to guess, to know, to derive from informal communication with members of the audience what interests them and what would interest them. Because the difficulty is, in many instances, members of the audience would not be able to express this information demand, because expressing it would mean to have some pre-knowledge that the journalist may have, but not the member of the audience. So that is why I say not only the manifest information demand, but also the latent information demand. A journalist has to have some kind of feeling what would interest the public. Well, let me start with perhaps one of my first hypothesis, namely that science journalism is a kind of observer of science and a producer of public knowledge, not just a disseminator or translator. This contradicts many perceptions of journalism, of science journalism. And even science journalists themselves would often say they are the translators of science. And I mean, there are many instances in which that seems to be the case, and translation in a certain meaning is actually part of the game, but it is not the essence, it is not the core of science journalism or journalism in general. So the common perception of science journalism can be expressed in this information transfer or translation model. Then you have science, and science is the originator of new knowledge. So science makes a scientific message. That scientific message somehow reaches science journalism in many ways by means of publications or press releases or interviews and so on. Science journalism transmits it usually in a transformed way to an audience, and the audience receives it and it learns something about science, or ignores it, or makes its own sense out of it. And science journalism in this model is treated mainly as a channel that of course is not really neutral to the information transmitted, or a translator that means giving it a positive meaning, that science journalism does something, transforms the scientific message before it is transmitted to the audience. And I mean, there are many studies that focus on that, or that use that model to make an evaluation of science journalism, to say is doing its job good or not so good. And the quality criteria that follow from that model are quite clear. From a channel, you expect undistorted transmission without noise. That is, if you have a hi-fi speaker system, you want the original sound that the musicians played as undisturbed as possible coming from the speakers into your ear. That is what you expect from such a channel. And all studies usually find that journalism is not doing well if you apply that model, if you have that quality criterion. And you can say, well, this is the proof that science journalism is not doing its job properly. Or you can say, well, this is the proof, perhaps, that the model is not really sufficient, that the model you should apply to science journalism, to analyze it, to evaluate it, should be a little more complex than this simple information transmission chain.